The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, a white curtain drawn across the world. It had been falling for 2 days, and Leanne's hope, the last warm thing she owned, was beginning to freeze. Each step was a plunge into a cold, bottomless ocean. The dark red wool of her dress was heavy with ice, its color a single drop of blood in the vast, pale wilderness. Her late husband had bought her the fabric in a dusty San Francisco market, a foolish, beautiful expense. Now it was the only thing of value she had left, and it was failing to keep the cold from her bones. Ahead, through the swirling snow, a weak yellow light pulsed like a dying star. A cabin. It was the only sign of life she had seen since leaving the raw, muddy edges of the mining camp 2 days ago, her small bundle of possessions clutched to her chest. She had heard whispers of a man who lived alone in these mountains, a trapper who kept to himself. A giant, they said, a savage. But the whispers also said he was honest, and honesty was a rarer currency than gold. Stumbling, her breath a ragged tear in the quiet air, she fell to her knees a dozen yards from the door. The light seemed to recede, to mock her. She crawled. The rough-hewn wood of the porch was a sudden, solid reality under her numb hands. She pulled herself up, her body a dead weight, and knocked, the sound swallowed by the storm. She knocked again, a frantic, desperate drumming, before the world tilted and slid into blackness. The door opened on a groan of strained leather hinges. Abel stood there, a mountain made of man, filling the entire frame. His hair and beard were a wild, dark tangle dusted with snow from his last trip to the woodpile, and his shoulders strained the seams of his heavy wool shirt. He looked down, his eyes accustomed to scanning for tracks of bear or elk, and saw only a heap of dark red cloth and black hair splayed on his porch. For a long moment he did not move. Strangers were trouble. They brought the noise and the greed of the world below, the very things he had climbed this mountain to escape. But this was not a swaggering prospector or a lost hunter. This was something small and broken. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, a sound of profound reluctance, he bent down. His hands, calloused and huge, were surprisingly gentle as he gathered her up. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the encroaching storm, and laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth. The cabin was sparse, functional, smelling of pine smoke, curing leather and loneliness. He stood over her, a massive, uncertain guardian, watching the firelight flicker on her pale face. Her lips were blue. He fetched a rough wool blanket and draped it over her, his movements clumsy. He was a man who knew how to set a snare and read the sky, but the presence of this fragile woman in his home was a language he did not understand. He retreated to his chair, cleaning his rifle with deliberate mechanical motions, his gaze returning again and again to the still figure by his fire. Leanne awoke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. The fire in the great stone hearth was a roaring, living thing, and a thick blanket was tucked around her chin. A giant of a man sat in a chair across the room, his back to her, oiling a long rifle. He was immense, his presence seeming to shrink the already small cabin. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She sat up slowly, the blanket pooling in her lap. The movement made a small sound, and the man turned his head. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky, and they held no warmth, only a deep, unreadable watchfulness. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. She clutched the blanket tighter. "I am sorry to intrude. The storm—" He gave a short, sharp nod, accepting the explanation without comment. He got up and poured coffee into a tin mug, then held it out to her. His hand was twice the size of hers. She took it, her fingers trembling. The heat was a shock, a blessing. "My name is Leanne," she said, her voice thin but steady. He watched her for a moment before answering. "Abel." The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. She knew she could not stay without purpose. Charity was a debt she could never repay. "I can work," she said, forcing the words out. "I saw no kitchen in the camp. I imagine you eat poorly." A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his face. "I manage." "I can cook," she pressed on, her desperation making her bold. "I can clean, mend your clothes. I will earn my shelter. I ask for nothing more than a corner to sleep in and enough food to keep from starving." Abel looked around his cabin. It was a place of pure utility. A cot, a table, 2 chairs, shelves for traps and supplies. It was not a home. It had not been a home for a very long time. He lived on salted meat, hard biscuits, and whatever he could boil in a pot. The thought of a real meal, of a stew with flavor, was a ghost from another life. He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, the straightness of her back. She was not begging. She was negotiating. He respected that. "There's a small cot in the corner," he said, gesturing with his chin. "The pantry has flour, salt, beans. Meat is in the smokehouse. If the food is good, you can stay until the thaw. Then you'll move on." "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Hope, fragile and nearly extinguished, rekindled itself into a tiny, steady flame. It was a contract, cold and simple, and for now, it was enough. The rhythm of their lives settled into a quiet pattern, dictated by the sun and the unending snow. Each morning, Abel would rise before dawn, his movements heavy but silent, and head out to check his trap lines. He would return hours later, covered in snow, his beard stiff with ice, often with a rabbit or a brace of grouse. He would leave the game on the porch, a silent offering, and retreat to the barn to tend his horse and chop wood. He never entered the cabin without stamping the snow from his boots, a new habit, a small concession to the order she was creating. Inside, Leanne transformed the space. The constant gnawing chill was pushed back by the steady warmth from the hearth and the iron stove. The smell of baking bread began to replace the scent of solitude. She found herbs he had forgotten in dusty jars, and used them to turn his stringy game into savory stews. She scrubbed the floors, washed the few dishes with a fierce determination, and mended his worn clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She worked from the moment she woke until she collapsed onto her small cot at night. Her labor a constant, unspoken argument for her own worth. Abel watched her from the corner of his eye. He said little, but he saw everything. He saw the way she carefully measured the flour, wasting none. He saw the weariness in her shoulders at the end of the day. He saw the deep, ingrained dignity in her every movement. One afternoon, he came back to find she had washed his heavy wool shirts and hung them near the fire to dry. They smelled of soap and wood smoke, clean and warm. He had not known that scent in years. That evening, he ate his stew in his usual silence, but when he was done, he looked at her directly. "The food is good," he said. It was the first compliment he had ever given her, and to Leanne it felt like a promise. Trust was not built with words in this silent cabin. It was built with split logs and hot meals, with mended seams and a fire that never went out. It was a slow, patient thing, growing in the quiet spaces between them. One night, the storm returned with a vengeance, rattling the window panes and screaming down the chimney. The cabin felt like a small, fragile ship in a furious sea. Leanne was kneading dough for the morning's bread, her movements rhythmic and calming. Abel sat by the fire, sharpening a skinning knife on a whetstone, the rasp of steel on stone a steady counterpoint to the wind's shriek. The isolation, the oppressive sound of the storm, seemed to loosen something in her. "He died on the railroad," she said softly, not looking up from her work. Abel's hands stilled. He waited. "His name was Chen," she continued, her voice a low murmur. "He was a good man. He worked so hard. He believed in the promise of this country." She paused, her knuckles white in the dough. "When the blast happened, they buried him with the others. They gave me a small pouch of coins and told me to go. There was no place for a Chinese widow in the work camp. In the town, they look through you, or they look at you with a certain kind of hunger." She shuddered, a slight involuntary movement. "I used the last of the money to buy supplies, and I walked away. I heard them talk about the mountains, about a place where no one would bother me." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I did not know it would be this cold." Abel set the knife and stone aside. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of shadows. The world he had left behind was full of such casual cruelty. He had seen it, felt it. "My family had a farm, back east," he said, the words rough, as if pulled from a deep well. "Good land. A man came who wanted it. A man with money and a friendly judge. He promised my father a partnership, then ruined him with papers and laws he didn't understand. He picked up a poker and jabbed at the logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. They took everything. My father, he couldn't live with the shame." He fell silent. The confession hung in the air between them, a shared ghost of loss and betrayal. "The mountains don't use fancy words," he said, his voice low and hard. "They don't make false promises. They are honest in their cruelty, and honest in their provision. That is all I ask for." He looked at Leanne, and for the first time his gaze was not just watchful, but held a flicker of understanding, of shared exile. The admission, however brief, changed the air in the cabin. The silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with a new, fragile weight. They were two people defined by what they had lost, finding a strange, unspoken shelter in each other's presence. The soft romance between them did not arrive with a sudden declaration, but grew as quietly and persistently as a flower in a rock crevice. It began with small, practical acts of care that went beyond their initial bargain. Abel noticed Leanne shivering on her cot one night, huddled under her single, thin blanket. The next day he returned not with game, but with the thick, soft pelt of a silver fox he had trapped weeks ago and had been saving. He laid it carefully at the foot of her cot, without a word. When she touched it, the fur was like a tangible warmth, a silent message. Your comfort matters. In return, Leanne began to look after him in ways that had nothing to do with her duties as a cook. She saw how the handle on his favorite axe was splintered and rough. While he was out, she spent hours sanding it down with a piece of broken glass until it was smooth as silk, then rubbing it with oil until the wood glowed. When he picked it up that evening, his hand closed around the smooth wood, and he stopped, his gaze finding hers across the room. He gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that held more meaning than a dozen flowery speeches. One evening, as she served him his plate of venison stew, her fingers brushed against his. A jolt, warm and electric, passed between them. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flushing. He looked down at his plate, a muscle working in his jaw, the unexpected touch lingering on his skin. From then on, a new awareness hummed between them. He started talking more. Not much, but enough. He would tell her about the tracks he'd found or point out a constellation through the cabin window. She, in turn, would tell him a story her grandmother used to tell, her voice a soft melody against the crackle of the fire. Their shared loneliness was slowly, carefully, being replaced by a shared solitude. When the supplies ran low, a trip to the nearest mining town, a place called Providence, became unavoidable. The journey down the mountain was long and arduous. Providence was a raw gash in the landscape, a collection of muddy streets, ramshackle buildings, and wary-eyed men. As they entered the general store, the sudden warmth and chatter were a shock after the silence of the mountain. The store owner, a man named Finch with a pinched face and watery eyes, looked up as they entered. His gaze slid over Abel's imposing form and then settled on Leanne, lingering with a greasy appraisal that made her skin crawl. "Well, look what the mountain coughed up," Finch said, his voice laced with a sneering familiarity. "Didn't figure you for the type to need company, Abel." Abel ignored him, placing his list on the counter. "Need flour, salt, coffee, and kerosene." Finch's eyes stayed on Leanne. She stood slightly behind Abel, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, the vibrant red of her dress looking foreign and conspicuous in the dim, grimy store. "Quite the little cook you've found yourself," Finch continued, leaning on the counter. "Where'd you pick her up? Down at the railroad camps?" The question was loaded with insinuation, designed to strip Leanne of her dignity, to reduce her to a commodity. Abel's hand, which had been resting on the counter, slowly curled into a fist. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously low. "Just fill the order, Finch." The store owner gave a wet, unpleasant chuckle. "No offense meant, just surprised is all. A man could get lonely up there. If you ever find she's more trouble than she's worth, I'd be willing to take her off your hands. My wife is always complaining about needing help." The offer was an insult wrapped in a layer of false civility. He was talking about her as if she were a mule to be traded. Leanne flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but Abel saw it. He turned his head slightly, his gray eyes locking onto Finch with an intensity that made the store owner's smirk falter. "I said," Abel repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "fill the order." The threat was unspoken but absolute. Finch, for all his bluster, was a coward. He swallowed and began to gather the supplies, the silence in the store now thick with menace. The ride back up the mountain was silent, but the peace of their solitude had been shattered. Finch's words echoed in the space between them, a poison that had seeped in from the world below. Leanne felt the familiar sting of shame, the feeling of being judged and categorized by the color of her skin and her status as a widow. She had thought, for a little while, that she had escaped it. Abel was consumed by a cold, quiet rage. He had built his life on this mountain to be free of men like Finch, men who used words to chip away at others, who saw people as objects to be owned or discarded. He had allowed that world to touch Leanne, to wound her. The guilt sat like a stone in his gut. For days after, a new tension settled in the cabin. Leanne was quieter, her movements more reserved. The easy, budding warmth between them had been chilled. Abel found himself watching her, wanting to say something to fix it, but the words wouldn't come. He was a man of action, not of speeches. He didn't know how to mend a hurt made of air and malice. His frustration grew, simmering beneath his calm exterior. He chopped wood with a ferocity that bordered on violence, the axe splitting logs with clean, savage strokes. He knew Finch would not let it go. Men like him saw a challenge in silence, an invitation to push harder. He felt a deep, primal need to protect the small circle of peace he and Leanne had created, and he knew it would require more than a warning. It would require a stand. The inevitable second trip to Providence loomed. The winter was deep, and one more large supply run was necessary to see them through to the spring thaw. Leanne was visibly anxious. "I do not need to go," she offered one morning, her voice small. "You can go alone." Abel stopped packing the saddlebags and looked at her. Her hope, the thing he had first sensed in her, was flickering again. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of being publicly shamed once more. "No," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You are not a secret. You are not something to be hidden. You will come with me." It was not a request. It was a declaration. They would face Finch and the town together. They entered the general store, and the handful of prospectors and townspeople inside fell silent. Finch was behind the counter, a smug look on his face, as if he had been expecting them. He saw Leanne, and his lips curled into a disdainful smile. He decided to make a public spectacle of it. "Back again, Abel?" he called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you reconsider my offer? I'll give you a fair price. $50. More than she's worth, I'd wager." The men in the store snickered. Leanne froze, her face draining of color. She felt every eye on her, pinning her like an insect to a board. She wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but there, standing in her red dress, the subject of a cruel transaction. But Abel did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable mountain, and let Finch's ugly words hang in the air. Then he took a slow step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Leanne, a human shield. He looked not at Finch, but at the other men in the store, his clear gray eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. The snickering died. "This woman," Abel began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded the room, "is named Leanne. She is not for sale." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She came to my home in a storm, with nothing. She has worked harder than any man in this room to earn her place. She has brought warmth and decency to a place that had none." He turned his head and his gaze fell on Leanne, and for the first time, in front of all these strangers, his expression was unguarded, filled with a fierce, protective tenderness. "She is not my cook," he said, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "She is my home." He then turned his gaze back to Finch, and it was as cold and hard as granite. "And if you, or any other man, ever speaks to her with disrespect again, you will find out how quickly this mountain can fall on you." The threat was absolute. Finch paled, his smugness evaporating into pure fear. The other men shifted on their feet, looking away, ashamed. Abel had not just defended her. He had publicly given her a name, a story, and a place of honor. He had transformed Finch's shame into his own. Without another word, he placed his supplies on the counter, paid with his coins, and gently placed a hand on Leanne's shoulder, guiding her out of the store and into the clean, cold air. The journey back up the snow-covered trail was made in a profound and peaceful silence. The confrontation in the town had been a storm, and now, in its aftermath, the air was clear. The world felt new. Back inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them like a comforting embrace. The small space no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It was a sanctuary they had fought for and won. Leanne took off her cloak and hung it by the door, her movements graceful and sure. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, shining light. Abel watched her, his heart full of a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a decade. It was more than just protectiveness. It was a deep, resonant belonging. He had spoken the truth in that store, a truth he hadn't even fully admitted to himself until the words left his mouth. She was his home. He crossed the room and stood before her. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was hesitant, but incredibly tender. "I meant what I said, Leanne," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of relief, of a long and weary journey finally reaching its end. "I know," she whispered. He wiped the tear away with his thumb. The simple gesture held all the promises he did not have the words to speak. He was not a man of poetry or grand declarations, but his actions had spoken a language clearer than any words. He had given her safety, then respect, and finally a place in the world, at his side. That evening they sat at the small table and shared their meal. The storm outside could rage all it wanted. Inside, by the light of the fire, two lonely, wounded souls had found their shelter. The future was an uncharted wilderness, but they would face it together, their quiet companionship a bulwark against the cold, a steady, unwavering flame of hope.